Okay. Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I welcome this motion and I welcome the landmark deal that the Government has secured to ease the debt burden that we inherited from Fianna Fáil. In March 2010, when the chaotic Fianna Fáil-led government cooked up the promissory note to recapitalise Anglo and Irish nationwide, I warned of the consequences. In fact, Fianna Fáil seemed to still think at that time that Mr Fingleton and Mr Fitzpatrick were some kind of economic whiz kids who had reinvented banking so that it only produced profits and never any issues around debt or sustainability. Following the disastrous bank guarantee, Fianna Fáil announced that it was immediately pumping, at that time, 8.3 billion into Anglo by way of the promissory note, with a further 10 billion to come and a separate 2.6 billion for nationwide. And I remember the gasps in this chamber when those figures were announced. It then compounded this dodgy deal by taking a 2-year repayment holiday, thereby passing the poison pill onto this government in what I suppose was considered a neat piece of political footwork at the time. At that time, I was clear about what such a toxic arrangement would mean: a 2.1 billion payment a year by taxpayers to cover the cost of crony capitalism. As we all know, thanks to Fianna Fáil's breathtaking incompetence and Anglo's rogue banking, the bill grew even higher. When all was done and dusted, taxpayers were left on the hook for 3.1 billion in promissory notes, for 31 billion in promissory notes, and a 3.1 billion annual payment before a cent was spent on health, education or welfare. Anyone who's ever been involved in running a household budget or indeed a business knows that cash flow is vital, and 3.1 billion annually was a crippling amount of cash for any government to pony up each year. And not having now to actually borrow and pay the interest on that annual cash flow requirement of 3.1 billion. It's an enormous improvement in Ireland's debt sustainability, which is critical to getting us out of our difficulties. As Labour finance spokesperson in 2008, I opposed the bank guarantee because I knew it was a reckless gamble in which Fianna Fáil essentially bet the public purse on Mr Fitzpatrick and Mr Fingleton and their like. And at the time I warned that the Exchequer or some specially created public agency may become an owner of vast amounts of dodgy debts and the property associated with them, which is exactly what happened with NAMA. Once the disastrous promissory note was put in place, I consistently argued that it needed to be renegotiated so that Ireland could repay over a longer term in a way that did not inhibit recovery or debt sustainability. I have never been an advocate of default. As the former IMF Director Donald Donovan pointed out last week, the effects of a default would have been catastrophic, fatal to the government's efforts to re-enter the bond markets, and disastrous for our reputation as a stable location for foreign investment and as an open trading economy. We are incredibly dependent on trading to make our living in Ireland. There is also a fiction perpetrated by certain commentators and opposition members that a default would make all of our problems disappear in a puff of smoke. I think you should ask the Argentinians about that. More than a decade after Argentina defaulted, hedge fund creditors are still chasing it through the international courts, and the country is indefinitely shut out of international financial markets. Recently, the Argentinian president was concerned that if she left the country on the jet, that the jet would be seized by creditors. Do the same commentators and members of the opposition wish to reduce Ireland to such a pariah status? These are inconvenient truths that the default vigilantes on the opposition benches are never prepared to address. Rather than default, I often cited the example of the Marshall Plan and the follow-on to the 1953 London Debt Agreement, which allowed Germany repay its legacy debts over a much longer period and rebuild after the war. Such a deal, I argued, would be crucial to Ireland's recovery and would be a demonstration of European solidarity. I'm very happy to say that the Government has now secured precisely such a deal through careful negotiation, persistence and determination. The deal will ensure that Anglo has been wiped off the map and the promissory note torn up. It will ensure that the IBRC-related debt is tucked in to a longer-term bond, which will allow the state pay over a much longer period at a lower rate of interest. And as I said, a cash flow benefit of 20 billion over the next decade, and deficit reduction of up to 1 billion per year over the coming years. This is a key milestone on Ireland's road to recovery, significantly enhancing our debt sustainability along the lines I advocated. We won't have to pay the first principal until 2038 and the last in 2053, by which time inflation will have ensured that the real value of these payments has lowered significantly. Can I just say, and I know that people across the way will understand the mathematical facts around the value of money. In 1973, 40 years ago, Irish GDP was 3.76 billion. Today it stands at 168 billion. So in other words, over that 40-year span, there was on average a 10% increase in our GDP. So the debt, which seems so sizable now, will eventually be dwarfed by economic growth and inflation, and that's assuming that we even have to pay the principal from 2038 on, because once the country is sustainable, there will be a strong market for our bonds, and it's more than likely that if we wish at that time, or future governments wish at that time, they will actually roll the debt over, which is the normal course of action for many countries. So there's a further way to go. We have to continue to negotiate on the rest of our bank-related debt and seek solutions that will further improve our debt sustainability, in particular the extension of our bailout loans, and as you know, the Government has ongoing work in progress on that. But all of this effort will be in vain if we cannot use these improvements in our debt position to ease the burden for our hard-pressed citizens. The people of this country have stayed the course throughout the financial collapse, the economic upheaval that followed, and the austerity budgets that were unfortunately an inevitable consequence. But there is a limit beyond which additional austerity becomes counterproductive. And after 5 years of a European response centred on austerity, I believe that we are close to that point now. The IMF, through its staff reports and other reports, has itself admitted it underestimated the effects of austerity on economies throughout the financial crisis. As someone who has long argued that deficit reduction, while sensible, cannot be implemented too quickly, I welcome that admission. Ireland has to get its deficit down. That is inescapable. We spend more than we take in, and we borrow to plug the gap. Of course, we have to tackle that issue and put the public finances in order, and this government is committed to doing that. But the proponents of austerity seem to think that deficit reduction can only be done in one way, by cutting endlessly. In fact, the best way to reduce the deficit is to get more people back into work, which would boost consumer spending, increase the state's tax take and reduce the borrowing requirement. And that's why, as Social Protection Minister, I have sought to protect the welfare budget and core weekly rates, reform employment supports and significantly increase the number of activation places to help people get back into work, education or training. CSO data today underlines once again the crucial importance of welfare payments in reducing poverty. The data shows that in 2011, welfare payments reduced the at-risk of poverty rate in Ireland from 51% to 16%. That is actually the best outcome in the European Union. But the welfare budget is not only about protecting the most vulnerable. The 20 billion welfare spends acts as a Keynesian automatic stabiliser, supporting the economy by putting money into the hands of consumers who need it, and through these hands into the tills of businesses, shops, pubs, enterprises, right throughout the country on a regional, countrywide, island-wide basis. The role of the welfare system in stabilising economic demand is well acknowledged internationally.
Minister, I'm going to have to ask you to conclude because you're
going
to eat into
and I just want to refer to the effects the Congressional Budget Office in the US has noted the impact of welfare spends in stabilising European economies. And what I want to say is that we have to use the proceeds from the promissory note deal to invest in our people and our economy, and we need to do so starting this year. We now have, I think, a very good base on which to regrow the Irish economy, get people back to work and invest in the country.
Thank you, Minister.